Labyrinths is brought to you by Knox Robinson Productions. Please consider becoming a patron. For as little as $5 a month, you can listen to Labyrinths ad-free.
Visit patreon.com/KnoxRobinson to learn more.
When I was 4 years old, my family took a quick vacation to this incredibly peaceful location on Lake Winnipesaukee in New Hampshire. And it was our first night there, and my mother decided it was time to cook dinner. And she rummaged around the house for lighter fluid. She thought she found some. I stood right next to her on this porch as she poured the lighter fluid on the coals. They didn't light. She poured the lighter fluid on the coals again. Well, it wasn't lighter fluid, it's a highly flammable household solvent. So in that moment, we were enveloped by flames and trapped. My mother sort of took one look at that situation and realized that the only way to save herself was to run through the fire and down into the lake. And that's what she did. But she left me there.
Feeling lost?
Then you're in the right place.
I'm Amanda Knox.
And I'm Christopher Robinson.
And this is Labyrinths.
That was the voice of psychologist Dr. Lise Deguire, author of Flashback Girl, Lessons on Resilience from a Burn Survivor, which tells the story that began that fateful day when she was 4 years old, and takes readers through the years in which she endured reconstructive surgeries, bullying, and social isolation. With a visible disfigurement, she faced difficulties in many aspects of life most of us take for granted, like finding love or being a parent. But that burden also led her to become a clinical psychologist and to find satisfaction in her life, not in spite of her trauma, but from the wisdom she gained about the world and about herself by living through it.
So I was eventually rescued by my father and taken to the hospital. And then they transferred me to the best burns hospital in the country, thank God. And at the end of all that, I was burned 65% of my body. And this is back in 1967. I'm very lucky just to be alive. But being alive has entailed about 75 surgeries and procedures by now to reconstruct my body and to make me look better. And that's just the medical part. It's the psychological part and the social part have been extremely challenging.
Can you tell me a bit more about what it was like to grow up? Very few people even have memories from before 4 years old. So it seems like you've been carrying this your entire life. What was it like to process this in your childhood?
Well, it took a long time, and perhaps you can relate to this. Sometimes you come to understand things over time that you didn't in the moment of the trauma. So it took me a long time to really accept everything that I had been through. And it took me an even longer time to understand that although one should be able to trust your mother to take very good care of you, in my case, that would be a mistake.
Yeah. How did that alter your relationship with your mother throughout time?
So I want to be fair to my mother. My mother's a human being, and I don't think anybody should be defined by the worst things they ever did, right? My mother was an incredibly intelligent person. She was a child prodigy. She was a classical pianist, very cultured, very smart, but she just should not probably have been a mother. She did not have a mother's heart of that instinct to protect your child at all costs. And that's just not just for me, it's for my brother too, who also came to tragedy. When push came to shove, my mother saved herself time and time again. And it took me a long time to understand that and to figure out how I needed to handle that. That really has been, in some ways, the harder journey, even than what I went through medically.
Yeah. So both you and your mom suffered burns, correct?
Yes.
So, was there any camaraderie, how you had to go through medical treatments, or did you really feel like you were on your own path?
So my mother was burned, I think 33%, and I was burned 66%. So yeah, I had a more challenging journey than she did medically. And no, I wouldn't say there was camaraderie. My mother was in the same hospital at the time, but she rarely came to visit me. And as I returned to the hospital many times for operations, she would come up every other weekend.
Wow.
And, I know that you're a mother yourself. I myself am a mother. And so it's funny, Amanda, but I didn't really come to understand this situation fully with my mother until I had children of my own. And when I did have children of my own, all of a sudden it was like, oh my God, I would never do that.
Yeah.
All of a sudden you're like, wait a second, that was pretty messed up.
Yeah.
And things that as a young person, I might think, well, she was busy or she had this going on. All of a sudden I'm like, wait a second, you're never too busy to be with your child in the hospital.
No. So beyond having the physical burden of these burns and these scars, how did that impact what it was like to be a child for you?
There were very bad things about it. I was bullied a lot by kids who didn't know me. And the kids who did know me were really quite nice. And I found also, and I'm not the only burn person to say this, that there's something about looking different that weeds people out. So the people who wanted to be my friend often were really wonderful people. And I'm still friends with many of them to this day. So there's something about looking different, looking really at the time terrible. I look 20,000 times better now. That, it screens for quality.
That's interesting. I was going to ask about that because I think, especially you understand as a psychologist, that a lot of times the traumas that people have are buried deep down inside of them, right? Like you can't necessarily see them just by looking at them across the street. You wouldn't know that somebody is suffering from depression or that they're being abused by their dad or whatever it may be. Like there are a lot of things that people keep separate or hidden that someone like yourself was unable to keep hidden. It was right there in front of everyone. And I a little bit had the same experience where, what the worst thing that's ever happened to me was very, very, very public. It just sort of became this defining thing of my life, whether I wanted it or not. But it had that similar reaction for me where it sort of weeded out the kinds of people that I would interact with. I almost got like a sense of who people were just by how they reacted to me upon first meeting me or even just being in the vicinity of me. And in a weird way, it sort of gave me a superpower into reading the characters of other people that otherwise I wouldn't have experienced. And so it sounds like you had a very similar thing happen to you.
Yes, I relate to everything that you're saying. There is something both excruciating about being so exposed, but also if you can learn to ride it, it does give you a lot of information.
Talk to me about learning to ride it. What did that look like for you?
So when I said learning to ride it, what I mean is there was a time that I wanted very much to just kind of fit in and, be normal, whatever normal is. And as I got older and stronger and more confident, the more I was like, no, you know what? I am not anything like probably anybody else that I know, and I'm not going to be. And what I've learned from this is actually extremely useful. Sometimes people ask me, well, what's it like to be a psychologist, with visible difference? And what I find is that it has helped my practice immensely because the first thing that you know about me is that I have also suffered. It's right there. So for anybody who's feeling like defensive about having to see a psychologist or inadequate or ashamed in some way, you can read on my face, no, I get you.
Yeah. When do you feel like you were trying the most to be normal or to fit in?
I think like in elementary school, I feel like in elementary school, you just want to look like everybody. And oh my God, junior high school, where you just want the same clothes and the same hair and the same shoes and all of that stuff. And I tried, but it was sort of ridiculous. The time when I really started to feel like I came into my own was in high school when I really embraced more being in the arts. I did acting, I sang, I played instruments, I got in plays. And then I just felt like, okay, these are my people.
I saw your TED Talk before coming to speak with you. And one of the issues that you raise is how people who are visibly different are represented in the arts. Can you talk to me about the experience of both being in the arts, but also observing the arts and how they represent people like you?
Something that most people don't really see until it's pointed out to them, and then they'll see it everywhere, is that people who are scarred are usually represented in movies or TV as being either villains or being pathetic. And so just for quick examples, I would point out Darth Vader, Voldemort, the Joker, Two-Face. So most people, not everybody, but almost everybody who walks out on screen with a scar or some sort of visible difference, it's like, da, 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 da. That person is probably going to be bad. And if they're not bad, they're like the pathetic person with no friends and nobody loves them, like the Hunchback of Notre Dame, for example. That's generally speaking how people who are disfigured are portrayed on screen. And it does tremendous damage. First of all, if you are disfigured and that's all you ever see of yourself on screen, it's pretty depressing. I mean, let's take the pretty out of it. It's depressing. And second of all, it sends the message to the general public again and again and again to either be like maybe a little wary and scared of people who look different. It just others us. And the other thing we know is that the stories we tell about people are incredibly powerful. So the LGBTQ community has benefited immensely over the last couple decades of better and better representation of stories about them on screen. When Glee came out, that made a big difference. Brokeback Mountain, Will and Grace. So there have been better and better stories about people in the LGBTQ community, and now prejudice has diminished a great deal. So my community needs that too.
How do you see prejudice in the way people treat disfigured people in your life and in the lives of other disfigured people that you know?
Yeah, well, there's a fair amount of research. There was a survey done of 800 people in the UK who were disfigured in some way, and they reported bullying, being harassed online, job discrimination. 1/3 of them said they had been the victim of a hate crime. It's a lot. And we are a small community. We are 1% of the population. And this 1% of the population is often enduring medical treatments and expenses and bullying and harassment. And so it takes a lot for people to get through all that and then stand up and say, we need to be treated better. You know what I mean? You have to come a long way through your trauma before, and I'm sure you can relate to this, before you're ready to stand up and say, look here, we need to change this. In the beginning, you're just dealing with your own trauma and that's all you can manage, you know?
Can you talk to me about certain instances in your own life of that kind of prejudice and how that impacted you?
I was apparently mostly undateable for a long time. It took me forever to find love. I mean, I did. Eventually, I'm married and I have children and my life has turned out fine now, but it was brutal to be out there looking different, looking for love. I was really, really interested in acting. And it came to me at some point like, well, that's not going to work. You know, who's going to, cast me looking like this? And I found that to be the case. As I got out of college and I would audition for local community theater and I would watch somebody else get a role that I'd seen their audition. And they did not audition me, but they got the role just the same. And I thought, oh, yeah, I don't look like this part, do I?
One of the things that really bothered me when I was first convicted was the idea that I would never get to be a mom just because, I'm stuck in a prison cell. And I wonder, were you ever afraid that you were not going to be able to experience certain parts of life simply because there was, your scars between you and the rest of humanity?
I started off confident that I would, because I thought, well, I'm lovable enough, but it just wasn't working for me to find love. And at some point I thought, and this is where my options were different, I thought, well, if I don't find someone who wants to marry me by the time I'm 35, I will do some sort of artificial situation. Or I have a very dear close friend of mine who's a gay man, and I thought maybe we'll have a child together. I was going to do it because I always wanted children. I was going to have them, but I thought it was going to be not easy. Not that having children the regular way is easy, right?
True that. Yeah. When did you first feel like you needed to stand up for yourself? And what was that moment like? Did you just have an epiphany moment of, I'm sort of done just surviving my trauma, instead I want to stand up for myself?
That has been a long journey. And I don't want to imply that I was not assertive. I think I've always been pretty assertive, but I was assertive in just kind of getting through my life as best I could, as opposed to having a voice about disfigurement and resilience and standing up for burned people and people who look different. That came as a result of writing my book. I wrote my memoir about 4 years ago. It's called Flashback Girl. And as a result of that, I was asked to speak a lot, and I've connected much more with other people who look different, and was invited to join this thing or that thing. And I've just become more and more of an activist. It's one of the blessings of one's children being out of the house is that you have more time to devote to work. And this turns out to be work that I will pretty much do anything or go anywhere to support.
I'm curious to know, because you've now raised your children, and how old are your children now?
27 and 25.
Wow.
And it goes like that.
Congratulations. I'm in the thick of it. I have a 2.5-year-old and a 5-month-old. So I'm right at the very beginning here. I just had my second very recently. And I wonder how your trauma experience and how you've survived it informed your motherhood.
Yeah, immensely. So I think the thing I want to say before I get to your question is that although I've described to you that my mother she was who she was, and she was very limited as a mother. And my father, by the way, was more or less the same. But I had an older brother, and his name was Mark Emile Deguire. He was 5 years older than me, and he was extremely all the things that my parents were not. He was very attuned. He was extremely loving. He was very attentive. He cared about me. He would more or less do anything for me. And I think I learned how to be a mother from him.
Oh, that's lovely.
So when I had children, I brought the skills that he gave me in terms of attentiveness and listening and prioritizing their safety and well-being. I brought all of that he gave me to them.
And how is that manifested? Have there been times where, you literally didn't have to pull them from a fire, but maybe figuratively? Have there been moments like that where you came through for your kids in ways that your own parents didn't?
I think when you have children, you basically have to put their best interests ahead of yours. What, 90% of the time, right? Obviously you need to sleep. You need to eat. You need to do the things to keep you going and make money to pay the bills and all that stuff. But yeah, your kids' emotional needs and their safety needs and all that have to come ahead of yours just for 18 years. And even after that, to some degree.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think almost in every way, I have shown up for my children differently. And I believe if they were here, they would say that. It was a big goal of mine to kind of end what I believe to be a psychological pattern. It didn't start with my mother. It started with her mother and maybe her mother ahead of her. And I could see this kind of coldness that was in the family line. And I thought, okay, the buck stops here. And my goal was that my children would not experience that, and that therefore, hopefully someday their children, God willing, do not also experience that.
Yeah.
But it's hard to break a pattern.
Mm-hmm. I'm curious to know, actually, after hearing you talk about the various representations of disfigurement in media, the scar from The Lion King and, the Hunchback of Notre Dame and all of that, I'm curious to know, what do you think about Deadpool?
So, yeah, I mean, he's not so bad, right? He's powerful. He does good things, but he can only do those good things when he's masked up.
Interesting.
And he's a little bit of a renegade, right? He's not just kind of a love normal member of society as far as I can see.
So, yeah, I hear you. Like, maybe the problem with media is it represents disfigured people as broken people.
Yes.
And maybe what you're looking for is a person who happens to have scars, but that's not the thing that is the driving force of their life.
Right. Just like the worst thing that ever happened to any of us doesn't become the only thing we ever think about or ever shapes our existence. Thank God.
Hey, listeners. Thanks for tuning in. This podcast is only possible thanks to listener support. So please consider becoming a patron. Visit patreon.com/KnoxRobinson.
Have there been surprising moments of happiness for you that wouldn't have been possible without what you went through?
So this book that I wrote, I have heard from people all around the world, actually. One person wrote that they were thinking about killing themselves, but now having read my book, they decided they wouldn't. And one person said that my book made them decide that they really wanted to be a psychologist like me to help other people. And one person said that they were burned, and because they read my book, they decided for the first time in 40 years they were going to go swimming. Those are pretty moving stories.
Yeah. Like, even just that swimming example is a really good one. Like, why limit the life you can live just because someone else might not recognize your humanity from across the swimming pool?
Right.
Do you think that socially it's easier to be a disfigured person today than it was when you were growing up, or is it still pretty much just as hard?
I think in some ways it's easier, in some ways it's worse. So the ways I think it's easier is I think people are much more attuned to bullying, and that bullying is wrong and you shouldn't do it. Like, I mean, when I was bullied, Amanda, it was just like, that's just how it was. I mean, it wasn't, there was not intervention for that, is my point. The intervention would be that people would say, sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me. And you were supposed to just kind of go with that, like, okay.
Right.
So now, if you're bullied, you talk about it, and there's school interventions and all that. So I think that it's better in that way. And the way I think it's much, much worse is social media. Think about What's next to your name on social media? It's your photo.
Hmm.
And if your photo is of a disfigured face, you have to decide if you are comfortable putting that out there. There's a story I heard, and this is a true story. There was a man in England who found that there was some kind of app, or I don't know, one of those like rate this face thing that was on the internet. And you were supposed to rank faces on a scale of 1 to 10. And at the 10 was the picture of a supermodel. And at the 1 was his face.
Oh, no.
And he couldn't get them to take it down.
Oh, no.
So social media is, and I'm laughing because I'm realizing I'm sure you have your own adventures with social media. It's like a blessing and a curse, right?
But you're right. Like, we do live in a highly visual culture that is stripped much of the time of its context. Like, when you were meeting people to date, back in the 70s and 80s, you'd have to actually meet people in order to even get a sense of what they would look like. Whereas now, dating is very much online for the majority of people. It's designed to be visually responsive. Like you swipe left or you swipe right without knowing a single thing about the human being. And it sounds like that would be incredibly difficult for someone who's visually different.
Exactly. A lot of people maybe don't have swipe right faces, but they are swipe right people.
What do you think we need to do about that?
I think every time there's a conversation like what you and I are having right now, it's immensely powerful. Because almost as soon as I talk about how disfigured people are represented, people are like, oh, yeah, that's right. That's terrible. We should stop that. Right? It's not that hard. Honestly, as soon as you think about it, to go, oh, right, okay. This person just has a different looking face. I ought to just sit next to them. But unconsciously, what happens, and research shows this, if there's a disfigured person in a room, people keep distance, physical distance, away from the person who looks different, as if it is contagious.
That's interesting. Do you think that this is something that if disfigured people were better represented, that it would go away? Or do you feel like there's something in human nature that is prejudiced against disfigurement?
That's a great question. Yes, and no.
Okay.
So I think if people are educated, that prejudice goes way down. And if you just start to interact with people who look different, just like anything else, you get to know a member of a group, you're like, oh, all right. So I think the more that people are educated, the more the stigma decreases.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, I think there is something in Western society that very much supports the equation that beauty is good. That's been in our society since like ancient Greece.
Mm-hmm.
However, there was a study done on this tribe. They're called the Hasdas, and I think they're in Tanzania. And they showed Hasda people pictures of disfigured faces and measured their level of stigma against them.
Mm-hmm.
And generally speaking, the Hasda people had no prejudice against disfigured people, except the more that particular member had been exposed to Western civilization, the more stigma they showed.
Wow.
That gets to one of the theories that has been out there, which you kind of alluded to, the theory that it might be innate. There might be a part of us as people that we see someone who looks different and we think, it's a disease, it's catching, I should stay away. But that Hasda study makes it seem like, maybe not so much.
Fascinating. Can I ask how you met your husband?
At work. I'd had a crush on him for a couple of years. He is my second husband. And unfortunately, I was married to my first husband at the time that I met my second husband, which is something I feel really badly about, but that is what happened.
That's life. No judgment.
So eventually we got together, and thank goodness for that. He's a good man, and he's been a really, really excellent stepfather to my two children.
So when my husband met me, it's a little interesting because he knew that I was in the middle of a true crime thing, right? Like he knew it was a scandalous thing. It had obviously been in the news and he's from where I grew up. And so people knew about it. He knew about it, but he wasn't like a true crime guy. He was very much a poetry school kind of guy. So it was out there, but it wasn't something he really knew a lot about. And when we first met each other and started hanging out and became friends, he specifically didn't Google me. He didn't like go down the rabbit hole of digging into the case and all of that. He just wanted to know me as a human being. And even in spite of the fact that when people found out that he was friends with me or eventually that he was dating me, they would say things to him like, "Oh my God, do you think she killed someone or whatever?" He always resisted defining me by that rubric, by this crazy experience that I had been through, even though it wasn't the only thing that connected us. And in fact, it wasn't the thing that connected us at all. And I'm wondering if you had a similar experience with the partners in your life, how your trauma has played a role in your relationship with them, if at all.
Well, first of all, hats off to your husband. He sounds like a very unique person. I think the few people who have managed to fall in love with me, the way that they have is that they've gotten to know me. I'm smart and I'm funny and I'm pretty interesting. And so if you get to know me, I think then beauty shines through. So maybe it is similar in that way. It's like, see all of me, not just this one thing that you might react to negatively.
Yeah.
I think that generally speaking, men who are with women who have some sort of body difference are kind of lauded as being like a little bit heroic. Must be a special guy, you know, and like you get kind of props for that in society, which by the way, I find a little bit annoying.
Yeah.
I really do pull my weight as an interesting person to share life with, you know.
Yeah. What about with raising your kids? One thing that I've wondered, and I'm going to have to figure this out as I go along, is how much my trauma is going to impact their lives. I know that it's impacted my sisters' lives, for example. Like when I was going through everything in Italy, my sisters would get made fun of at school for being sisters with me. And so I'm just curious, how have your kids experienced your trauma, if at all?
I know that it was hard on, especially my older daughter, that I looked different and that there was a certain level of embarrassment around that when she was young. Little kids just want to fit in. And I was a mom who didn't look like the other moms. So I think that was hard. Figuring out how to talk with them about what I've been through, much as you will have to figure that out, was a delicate balance for me. And it's not just my scars, right? I mean, my mother and father situation, I didn't share this earlier, but my brother, the one I told you about, who was my angel, he died young. So there's been actually a tremendous amount of trauma in my family.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I decided that I wasn't going to lie ever to my kids because I don't think that's healthy ultimately. It gets you out of hot water in the moment, but in the long run, it leaves you in a mess. So one of the things that I did was wait for questions, answer them very generally, and then see if they ask other questions and then answer those. But I would always start kind of high level and then go down to the point where that was the end of what they wanted to know about. And that helped me judge what they could handle emotionally and what they wanted to know.
It occurs to me that there's going to be a moment, and it hasn't happened yet for me, where my kids are going to realize that I'm a little bit different than the other moms. And I don't know how I'm going to feel in that moment. Do you remember the moment when your kids first realized that you weren't just like the other moms?
I'm sorry, it felt really shitty.
Yeah.
I don't know how that doesn't feel shitty, because it's not just that you're different. It's like you're different in a way that was tragic and hard and challenging. It's not like different because, I don't know, you're a billionaire. That's a nice difference.
Right.
But speaking as a person who has carried tremendous trauma for more than 50 years, I'm sorry to say, I don't think it ever leaves us. I think we carry it, and maybe we carry it easier and more often easier, but there's still those moments where it's just devastating.
How do you carry it today?
Right now, I carry it with honor. I'm using it to help as best I can. And so now it feels like an honor to be able to do it. I was reading about you too, Amanda, and listening to things that you've done. And it sounds like you have also come out of what you've been through with this kind of mission of really wanting to help other people who are going through this, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that meaning making that you can take from something terrible, sometimes that feels great.
When have you felt the most lost? And do you feel like you've found your way again?
I felt the most lost when my brother Mark took his life. My brother Mark, who really was my mother, my father, my angel, all rolled into one, took his life when I was 14. And I lost him, and I was 100% adrift in life. And that was the hardest time. And the thing that I remember when that happened was just kind of this very clear knowing of like, I got to get myself together or I'm not going to survive this. And I went into therapy and I made a number of healthier choices in my life, and I didn't go crazy. But at that point, I thought it could go that way.
What was going on in your life at that time and in his life?
So in my life, I was in 9th grade. I was 14. I had friends. I was doing pretty well. I had kind of made my way into that more artistic community that I referenced earlier. And I was pretty happy, actually. But in his life, he was very adrift. My brother was a genius. He graduated high school in 3 years and he went to MIT as a physics major. And he really was the smartest person I've ever known. But he was adrift. He didn't have parental guidance and support. And he was depressed. And he came to feel that it would be better for him to not be here. And he really kind of intellectually convinced himself that that was the case. It was a tragic, tragic loss. And I believe that if he had had more adults looking out for him, he could have been saved. But he didn't.
Did he know how much he meant to you?
Yes. But I am entirely sure, 100% sure, that if he knew that the very sound of his name would be bringing me to tears 50 years later, he would have never done it. I think he completely underestimated the impact that his death would have on me and on everybody who loved him. I am sure that he didn't understand that. He was 19. What do you know when you're 19?
I wonder, do you feel like his loss is the biggest trauma of your life, or is it the burns?
It's a really good question. I'm going to say yes. Yes. And also, I mean, his loss is the most painful thing that has ever happened to me. Absolutely. But the hardest thing for me to bear and deal with and carry through has been the fire and the burns and the scarring and all that. That's just been a tremendous burden and still is. My brother's death is kind of like a clean cut through my soul, as opposed to this massive thing that I carry with me. If that makes sense.
Yeah,
Does that make sense?
That totally makes sense.
Yeah.
I'm curious to know how you feel and think about those two very different kinds of traumas. One that is, clean cut and private, and the other which is lingering and very public. You have both of these experiences, and what is it like to carry both, and how are they different psychologically?
Well, as you say, Mark's death is something that I share when I choose to share it. I'm sharing it with you now. I didn't have to, but I chose to. Mark's death also is something that most people can relate to. Now, most people can't necessarily relate to a suicide in their family, although unfortunately it's not as rare as we'd like to think, but almost everybody can relate to the death, the profound loss of a loved one. So that's a universal experience versus looking different, the medical trauma, the social trauma, the emotional trauma of the scars. That feels more like this thing that paradoxically everybody can see, but hardly anybody can understand. So it's like a mirror image.
Having survived both of these, does processing one help you process the other, or are they completely different healing journeys?
Yeah, so first of all, I should give a shout out to my 7 therapists that I've had over the course of my life. I always want to make sure that I say that because I'm a psychologist. We do honorable work, at least most of us do. And there's no way I would be sitting here talking to you the way that I am if I hadn't had a tremendous amount of help. I think they inform each other in that. And again, I'm sure this is something you can relate to. If you have endured a great trauma, you know you can endure great traumas. There's a certain just confidence that comes from that. Not that I want another one.
Right.
I don't. I feel I've had plenty. But I know I'm the sort of person that can get through very, very challenging things. And that feels extremely helpful that the trauma can inform each other in that way. But, I think, and I say this also as a psychologist, like I've heard many, many different kinds of suffering. And in some ways, every one of them is an incredibly unique story. And in some ways, they're not unique at all.
Yeah. Can you tell me about that? How is your story unique and also not unique at all?
I don't think most people have had I don't want to say their entire body, but most of their body reconstructed and incredibly painful. And burn pain is unimaginable physically. It's extraordinarily painful. One of the reasons why I wrote my book, Flashback Girl, was that I felt like no one really understood what I had been through. Even people like my best friend, I felt like just couldn't really understand what it is like to go through this process. And so that was very healing for me to write it out and say, look, here you go. If you want to understand me, you can read this. And like I was saying before, suffering is suffering and pain is pain. And I find when I sit down and talk with people, okay, even you and I have not been falsely imprisoned in an Italian prison, interrogated when I knew very little Italian, and persecuted by a prosecutor. I've never been through any of those things, right? But I feel like you understand what I'm saying, and I feel like I understand what you're saying on a pretty deep level.
And that's a nice unexpected consequence.
Recently, I heard of an opportunity. There's a modeling agency. They're called Zebedee Talent, and they specialize in people who look different. And I heard that they had an open call for models with visible difference. And I thought to myself, I'm too old for that. And then I thought, well, there are older models. And then I thought I'm too old. And then I thought, no, you know what? There are older models. And then I thought, the hell with it. I'll just apply. And they signed me.
That's amazing.
Yeah. Now, do I think this is really going to go anywhere big? Not at all. But there is at least one opportunity that they want to use me for. And I think it's extraordinary to go from being somebody who, was really mocked and bullied for how I looked and, couldn't get parts and plays because of how I looked, to getting signed as a model. I mean, what the heck?
Is there anything else you'd like to tell me before I let you go?
Well, there's one thing I just wanted to share with you. It's not about me, though. I think it was in the Netflix video.
Mm-hmm.
There was a moment in that video that touched my soul. I still kind of get a little bit emotional to think about it. And it was the moment where somebody was talking to your father about how it was time to monetize your story. Otherwise, the opportunity would be lost. And he responded I am not interested in monetizing my daughter's story.
Mm-hmm.
And I was so touched by that. I think partly because of what that just represented, in terms of his honorableness and his protection of you. And also partly because, frankly, I didn't have that kind of level of protection.
It's one of the saddest things that I hear when I hear about people who've not had loving, protective parents like I have. I have had extremely loving and protective and attentive parents. I learned how to be a loving and attentive parent from them. And it's always devastating to me, the idea that a child would not have that person in their life. And I'm so glad you had that in your brother, at least for the amount of time that you did, because I feel like that's potentially one of the greatest traumas that anyone could ever have, is not having that.
Yeah. And it's awful when you don't have that. But the psychological literature on this is pretty clear. A child needs somebody. It's best if it's a mother and a father, of course, but they really just need somebody. They need a brother. They need a grandparent. They need a teacher even. They need somebody who cares for them, who's prioritizing them, looking out for them, wants the best for them. But it's interesting. I think a lot of people think, well, if you have parents who are neglectful or not good, that child doesn't have a chance. But yes, they do, as long as they have somebody who believes in them and cares.
Can I ask one final question? After Mark passed, who was that person for you? Did you have a person anymore who could be looking out for you?
I had a series of people who showed up for me. I won't say that it was one person. And that I miss. But I had almost a phalanx of friends who came in to support me, including many of my brother's friends who were just we are here for you. And so I had not a person, but I had a platoon.
Nice. I love that.
You can find out more about Dr. Lise Deguire at lisedeguire.com. Her book, Flashback Girl, a 2020 Nautilus Gold Award winner, is available on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and bookshop.org.
In the meantime, get lost with us. Find us on Twitter, @AmandaKnox.
@ManUnderBridge.
You can learn more about our work and how to support it at knoxrobinson.com. We hope you find these stories of resilience inspiring enough to overcome whatever obstacles are preventing you from leaving us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts.
Labyrinths is brought to you by Knox Robinson Productions. This episode was written and produced by us. Our managing producer is Andre Sapp. Our assistant producer is Jasper Merrill. And our theme music is by Josh Budo Karp.
In the Labyrinth's podcast system, the listener is serenaded by two separate but equally important hosts, Amanda Knox, who brings authenticity and empathy, and Christopher Robinson, who brings intellectual curiosity. These are their stories.
What do you think, Knox?
Looks like a podcast junkie, shot up with one too many ads.
Should have become a patron from the looks of it.
Who wouldn't prefer ad-free episodes and signed books and live video hangouts over overdosing on ads in an alleyway?
Don't patronize me, Knox. Leave that to the listener.
Visit patreon.com/Knox Robinson.